Our next topic is Canada's not one but two civil wars. Yes, we did have two of them. They're just not quite the same. And before we get into that, you need to sort of remember that sort of conversation I had about what our elected institutions did in 1791, right? You remember our conversation about how the taxes that were like the elected assembly decided was the one who was responsible for raising money, but they weren't responsible for spending it. Okay, so Canada's two civil wars are about what is generally referred to as this idea of responsible government. And what that essentially means is that what you want is an alignment between the idea of who decides how the money is spent and the people who raise the money. And what that means is that, for example, if you don't like the taxes you're paying right now, you can change the government and, in theory, get those taxes changed. That's the idea, all right? And up in 1791, that was not the case. That was not a thing that existed. That's not how Canada worked. This is very similar in a lot of ways to the US's sort of contention about not wanting taxation without representation, um, but it's somewhat different in this sort of conversation. So, when we sort of talk about responsible government, we're talking about that alignment between taxes and the ability to make laws, so it's executive power. And when we talk about that, we're also talking about the possibility of sort of some changes in how governments work. Okay, so we're going to talk about the 1837 and 1838 rebellions in Canada, and those sound farther apart than they are. What you're talking about in this context is a rebellion in Upper Canada and a rebellion in Lower Canada, seeking essentially the same thing. Okay, so on the one hand, you're looking at an end to mercantilism, right? So you're talking about people wanting to be able to make policies that account for a certain kind of industrial development in Canada. So you're talking about people wanting to be able to build factories, you wanting to sort of end some taxation policies that we'll get into a little bit later on that basically discourage the transformation of manufactured resources in Canada. You're looking at all of those sorts of questions. And they're asking for responsible government. They're asking for governments that make those decisions. Okay? There are, as I said, two rebellions, one in 1837 and one in 1838. And the first one happens in 1837, and it happens in Upper Canada. So it happens in the Anglophone portion of the country, and it is in what is now Ontario. And if you've ever heard someone talk about Canada's Civil War is essentially a bar fight, this is what they're talking about. So, what I mean by that is that the leaders of this rebellion, it ends very, very quickly, like within a couple of weeks, a couple of months. Um, the leaders of this rebellion still serve in the elected legislative assembly when it's over, right? That is the degree of tension that exists here. And I mean, although, we do have sort of weird quips of Canadian history. So William Lyon Mackenzie King flees to the United States. He's a little bit more radical. The like weird quips of Canadian history here is that for some reason he does this dressed as a woman or in order to cross the border. That is sort of one of those quirks that we could get into, but I don't really think it's that important. Okay. So that early rebellion is in Upper Canada. It ends very, very quickly. It is pretty accurately described as like an extended bar fight, and the people who are involved go back to their regular lives as elected members of the Legislative Assembly that they just challenged. Okay, that's what happens in Upper Canada. In Lower Canada, this is a very different story. Okay, so in Lower Canada, this is an experience that is fueled by a certain kind of nationalism, right? That nationalism is connected to a belief that they are being oppressed by the British. And we sort of talked about some reasons why that might be the case. Okay, and that means that this rebellion is very different, and it is also dealt with quite differently by the Canadian government at the time. So it's bloodier in that almost 300 of the Francophone rebels die. It involves the declaration of martial law in Lower Canada, so the army steps in and have sort of violence in that, and it winds with a decisive defeat of the Francophone rebels. So while the members of the legislative assemblies in Upper Canada basically went back to work after this was over, none of the Francophones did, and that's not just because 300 of them died. There's a lot of sort of tension and there's a lot of pressure to sort of hold new elections and to sort of bar these extremists, these rebels, from sort of participating again. And that tension is really, really important. It is, we'll talk about this in a lot of different ways, but remember that sort of idea about being oppressed by the British never really goes away? So we'll talk about this throughout the semester. We will. But one of the things that winds up happening throughout Canada's history is that the way that the Anglophone population, so the English-speaking population in Canada, tells their history is very different from how the Francophone population tells their history, right? The Francophone population of Canada, so the Québécois and certainly Francophones who live outside of Quebec, can and do, in a lot of ways, tell most of Canadian history as a story about how they have been systematically oppressed and disadvantaged and harassed by English-speaking Canada for hundreds of years. And part of that history is the difference between these rebellions, right? If you can have a rebellion in Upper Canada, in the Anglophone portion of Canada, and nobody dies, and the worst thing that happens is this one newspaper owner runs and lives in the United States for 5 years, and even he comes back later. And then you have a rebellion over exactly the same issues less than 6 months later in the Francophone part of the country, and you declare martial law, and 300 rebels die. There's a tension there, and there's an idea that you're not treating us the same. And that idea is really, really important to sort of look at going forward.